Thank you for joining us for our annual prayer vigil from home. Our Bible verse this year comes from Psalm 17, verse 6. I am praying to you because I know you will answer, O God. Bend down and listen as I pray. The following video will guide you through 13 meditations on the death of Jesus. We hope you will enjoy them. First Presbyterian Church of Auburn has hosted an Easter prayer vigil from Good Friday through Easter morning for almost 2 decades. In 2015, new member and art historian Ann Leader, that's me, created a series of 2-sided cards as visual aids to meditation and prayer. Bill Sherling installed them around the circumference of the chapel, as you see here in these photographs, and we have used them each year during the vigil ever since. This year we have created a virtual Easter prayer vigil. I will guide you through the 13 meditations. Press pause whenever you want to reflect on what has been said, turn to your Bible, or admire an image in silence. We also have a version of these meditations in written form, and you may want to use them instead to read on your own. These 13 meditations on the death of Jesus combine a work of art with a Bible verse and an explanation. I will tell you a little about the artist, the image, and the passage in the Bible that inspired it. By journeying with Jesus through his passion, we develop gratitude and compassion, not only for Jesus, but also for all those who suffer, whether through torture, injustice, imprisonment, illness, or a loss of faith. As we move from one meditation to the next, look carefully at the image. Take some time to let it sink in. See how it relates to the words you hear. Contemplate the image. Say a prayer. Sample prayers include, We adore you, O Christ, because by your holy cross you have redeemed the world. Or, Lord, teach me to live in and learn from your attitude of patient suffering. Meditation 1. Jesus prays on the Mount of Olives. Here we see the agony in the garden, painted by Giovanni Bellini around 1465, using egg tempera on a wooden panel. It is now in the National Gallery of Art in London. Giovanni Bellini, who was active between 1459 and 1516, spent his career in Venice, Italy. Together with his father Jacopo, his brother Gentile, and his brother-in-law Andrea Mantegna, Giovanni was a key player in the development of the High Renaissance style. He was sought after as a painter of religious scenes like this one, as well as mythologies and portraits, in large part because of his abilities to portray light, space, and three-dimensional form with convincing naturalism. In this medium-sized painting, it measures about 3 by 4 feet, we see Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives, while Peter, James, and John have fallen asleep, contrary to their teacher's request to pray. Luke tells us that Jesus was only a stone's throw away from his disciples, and Giovanni has made their proximity clear. Jesus prays to have his fate changed, but acknowledges that he will do God's will. Though not in all versions of this story, the 22nd chapter of Luke, verses 43 to 44, relates how an angel appeared to Jesus, encouraging him to carry on. Quote, In his anguish, Jesus prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down on the ground. Bellini shows the angel as a pale, small, winged cherub just above Jesus and to the right. The cherub holds a cup and a plate to symbolize the sacrifice that Jesus will shortly make on the cross, as well as the communion that his followers take in remembrance of him ever after. Jesus' death by crucifixion is foreshadowed by the dead tree in the middle left, behind which we see Judas approaching with the Roman soldiers who will arrest Jesus. In the distance, we see the sky lightening as dawn arrives, casting a rosy pink glow on what is otherwise a somber and foreboding scene. Our verse from Luke chapter 22, verse 42 reads, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done. Meditation 2. The Arrest of Christ. This small painting comes from a late 12th century illuminated manuscript, a handwritten, hand-decorated book. This particular book is a psalter or book of psalms. Because of the labor-intensive and expensive nature of bookmaking prior to the invention of the printing press, full Bibles were relatively rare. It was common to have only certain biblical texts produced, like a book of the Gospels or the Psalms. In the 12th century, when this book was made, psalters were the primary prayer book used by lay people, that is, people who were not members of the clergy. This psalter was made by monastic artists at the Norman Abbey at Fécamp in northeastern France. It seems to have belonged to a wealthy noblewoman, though her identity is unknown. The book is now kept in The Hague. The pages are made of fine animal skin known as vellum, and this lavish book contains 26 full-page illustrations, including this powerful scene showing the arrest of Christ. Painted using the abstract style typical of medieval art, the image shows Judas embracing Jesus at the composition's vertical center and kissing him on the cheek, a typical form of greeting in the Mediterranean world. Judas had arranged this as a sign to identify the man whom people were calling the Messiah. An angry, weapon-wielding crowd grabs and taunts Jesus, while Peter, seen behind Judas with short gray hair and a short gray beard, and the other disciples look on with dismay. Jesus also looks saddened, but resigned, for he knows that his arrest is part of his Father's plan. Our quote, also from Luke 22, now verse 48. Judas, is it with a kiss that you are betraying the Son of Man? Meditation 3. Jesus before Caiaphas. This large painting shows the first trial of Jesus after his arrest. The canvas measures 9 by 6 feet, making the figures and scene seem life-sized, as if we are in the room ourselves. When Jesus was questioned by the high priest Caiaphas about whether he had called himself the Messiah or Christ, Jesus replied, "You have said so. But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Jesus' response enraged Caiaphas, and the Sanhedrin demanded that Jesus be put to death. The Dutch Baroque artist Gerrit van Honthorst portrays the fateful event in a dark, seemingly quiet room, which suggests that Jesus has yet to give his reply. Caiaphas sits before a large open book, a symbol of his authority as interpreter of Mosaic law, which states that claiming to be the Messiah is punishable by death. The elders and scribes who make up the Sanhedrin stand behind him and line the back of the room. Jesus, brightly lit by the candle on the table, but also seemingly by a divine light, stands calmly with his hands folded in front of him and his head slightly turned down, reminding viewers of his humble acceptance of his fate. This picture, which is now in the National Gallery in London, originally belonged to the Roman gentleman Marchese Vincenzo Giustiniani, and it shows the influence of the great Italian Baroque artist Caravaggio, who had many followers, including Honthorst. They were attracted to Caravaggio's signature lighting effects, known as tenebrism, whereby bright lights are contrasted with areas of deep shadow. Honthorst brought this distinctive style back to his native Holland after a decade working and studying in Rome. Here, the candle casts a warm glow on both Jesus and Caiaphas, who will go on to tear his clothes in fury at Jesus' response to his questions, as if a calm before the storm of accusation and punishment to follow. Our verse is now from Matthew, chapter 26, verses 65 to 68. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has blasphemed. What is your verdict?" They answered, "He deserves death." Then they spat in his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, Prophesy to us, you Messiah. Meditation 4. Peter denies Jesus. Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio is widely recognized as one of the founding fathers of Baroque art. His brutally honest naturalism, searing drama, and emotionally charged tenebrism, which we just heard is that stark contrast of light and the absence of light, bring great power to his biblical narratives like this one. Here we see Peter at the right, pointing his hands towards himself in a "who-me" gesture, as a maidservant and a soldier point their accusatory fingers at him. Notice that she points 2 fingers and the soldier a third, for a symbolic total of 3 times that Peter is asked whether he is a follower of Jesus, and the 3 times that he denies the truth. He says, "Woman, I do not know him. Man, I am not one of them. Man, I do not know what you are talking about." Upon Peter's third lie, Luke tells us in his gospel, the rooster crows in the distance. Then Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the cock crows today, you will deny me 3 times." And Peter went out and wept bitterly. The denial of St. Peter was painted not too long before Caravaggio died prematurely in 1610, and the picture can now be found at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. By showing the characters only from the waist up, Caravaggio encourages us to feel a part of the intimately portrayed scene. Peter's denial and later repentance are a reminder to viewers of mankind's sinful nature and God's forgiving grace. Our quote again comes from Luke chapter 22, now verses 55 to 57. Then a servant girl, seeing Peter in the firelight, stared at him and said, "This man also was with Jesus." But he denied it, saying, "Woman, I do not know him." Meditation 5. Jesus before Pilate. This painting comes from a magnificent double-sided altarpiece known as the Maestà, or Majesty, which was painted by Duccio di Buoninsegna for the Cathedral of Siena in Italy, where it remains today. On one side, the painting shows Mary holding the infant Jesus surrounded by a crowd of saints and angels. And on the other side, we see the events from Christ's Passion, including this episode where he appears before the Roman governor Pilate for the second time. After initial questioning, Pilate sent Jesus to appear before King Herod, who ridiculed him and made him wear a white robe, traditionally reserved as an identifying uniform for the insane. Despite this humiliation, Jesus stands calmly, if sadly, before Pilate, while a crowd of soldiers is nearby to prevent the prisoner from escaping or causing any trouble. Elders, priests, and scribes look on, chattering among themselves about what they perceive to be Jesus' blasphemy, and offering accusations to Pilate, who asked Jesus, quote, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered him, "You say so." Then the chief priests accused him of many things. Pilate asked him again, "Have you no answer? See how many charges they bring against you?" But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed. Though quiet in its drama, Duccio's scene is nevertheless quite powerful, perhaps inviting the viewer to ask Pilate to intervene and stop the madness that will lead to Jesus' brutal death on the cross. Our verse is from Matthew 27, verses 13 to 14. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many accusations they make against you?" But he gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. Meditation 6. Jesus sentenced to death. Dutch painter Hieronymus Bosch painted this moving portrayal of Pilate handing over Jesus to be crucified early in his career, sometime between 1475 and 1480. The oak panel now resides in Frankfurt, Germany. A devoted Catholic, Bosch focused his work on mankind's sinfulness and folly, which are evident in the jeering faces of the bloodthirsty crowd. Pilate, dressed in red and wearing a conical hat, holds a scepter and stands in the doorway of his palace. Pilate presents the battered Jesus to the gathered mob, even though the Bible suggests that his beating and mocking came after his condemnation to death by crucifixion. Text by Pilate's mouth indicates that he speaks. Ecce homo, it says, here is the man, to which the crowd shouts back, Crucifige eum, crucify him. You can see those words coming vertically up from the crowd below. Now painted over, but showing slightly through, we can see that originally the picture included a group portrait at the lower left, likely the people who paid for the painting. They plead as they kneel in prayer, Salve nos Christe Redemptor, save us, Christ Redeemer. This request, which we can also see in the diagonal words coming from the second person who kneels, foreshadows what Jesus will say from the cross shortly thereafter. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing. Typical of Dutch painting at the time, Bosch portrays Jesus' accusers and contemners as caricatures of evil. Sneering, grimacing, and wearing odd-looking clothes, they embody corruption and blindness through their ugliness. We are invited, however, to remember that we too could have found ourselves among the crowd, indifferent to Christ's sufferings. Our verse is from Mark chapter 15, verse 12 to 14. Pilate spoke to them again. Then what do you wish me to do with the man you call the King of the Jews? They shouted back, Crucify him! Pilate asked them, Why? What evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, Crucify him! Meditation 7, the Mocking of Christ. Our verse is from Matthew chapter 27, verses 29 to 31. After twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on his head. They put a reed in his right hand and knelt before him and mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! They spat on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. After mocking him, they led him away to crucify him. Florentine artist Fra Giovanni da Fiesole, known as Fra Angelico, painted this moving scene as one of 50 frescoes that he designed for the Dominican friary of San Marco in Florence in the early 1440s. Each friar's cell has its own devotional image painted on the wall to inspire prayer and contemplation. Here we see a stripped-down portrayal of the mocking of Christ, quite different from traditional images that focus on the abuse and the abusers. Instead of a crowd of angry, taunting soldiers, we see only hints of the humiliations Jesus suffered before his crucifixion. Though the violence has been tempered, the impact is no less powerful. Jesus wears the white robe reserved for those deemed lunatic by Roman officials, and he is made to wear a crown of thorns, a painful reference to his indictment as King of the Jews. Jesus' white robe could also, however, remind viewers of his innocence and impending resurrection, just as the marble slab under his seat could lead us to contemplate the tomb from which he will rise. Disembodied hands surround Jesus' head in reference to the many slaps he received during his trial. And another man, shown only as a head, spits in his face and mockingly raises his cap. Though blindfolded, we can see Jesus' closed eyes through the fabric, which together with his slightly downcast gaze inspire great empathy. In the foreground sit two saints, Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Saint Dominic, the patron saint of the Dominican order. They are shown in deep thought and contemplation, modeling for us how we should comport ourselves as we reflect on Jesus' sacrifice. Meditation 8. Jesus takes up his cross. Martin Schongauer was a Renaissance painter and printmaker active in Colmar, Germany, now in France, during the late 15th century. Though he made most of his income through painting, he is best known today as a printmaker. The largest and most painterly of his prints His Christ carrying the cross that you see here is widely regarded as Schongauer's masterpiece. Created sometime between 1475 and 1480 using the engraving technique, this print demonstrates the artist's skill with its variety of lines to depict forms and shadows, and the excellent use of the paper itself to show highlights and empty space. Engraving requires the artist to incise lines into a copper plate that will hold the black ink impressed upon the paper. The benefit of the printing technique is that numerous copies can be made, allowing the image to be owned and enjoyed by many different people. This print is of an especially large size, as tall as a standard piece of paper and almost 17 inches wide. This engraving shows Christ's procession to Golgotha and is the artist's most visually complex. Schongauer created a spectrum of tones, from light to gray to black, by altering the density of his engraved lines. Throughout the print, he masterfully offset light and dark areas. For example, he placed the fully shaded figures on the right against a landscape delineated by only a few outlines. Because this page is crowded with figures, it requires close and concentrated looking to find everyone in the story. We get some of that story in our verse, Luke chapter 23, verses 26 to 28. As they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming up from the country, and they laid the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A great number of the people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children." Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell us that Roman soldiers forced Simon of Cyrene to carry Jesus' cross out of Jerusalem. Cyrene was on the north coast of Africa in modern-day Libya. Like many Jews from across the Roman world, Simon seems to have returned to live at Jerusalem, where he joined the so-called Synagogue of the Freedmen. It is not clear why Simon was chosen to bear the cross, but he serves as a model for us to share this burden and to develop a greater appreciation for Jesus' sacrifice. Simon also reminds us of Jesus' message to his disciples: "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." Though not mentioned in the Bible, Saint Veronica has been associated with the carrying of the cross since the 4th century. Various texts tell us that she wiped Jesus' face with her veil as he passed by on his journey to Calvary. According to legend, his portrait was miraculously imprinted on the cloth, creating a true image or vera icon of Christ. Also known as the sudarium, Veronica's veil is believed to be the cloth kept at St. Peter's Church in Rome since the 8th century. Like Simon of Cyrene, Veronica stands as an exemplar of compassion, as she offered Jesus a bit of respite from his trial by wiping the sweat from his face with her veil. Among the so-called 7 sorrows of the Virgin Mary is that she witnessed her son carrying his cross. John tells us in his gospel that, quote, "Standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, 'Woman, here is your son.' Then he said to John, 'Here is your mother.'" These friends and kin of Jesus can be seen in the far distance, lamenting the procession they have just witnessed and foreshadowing their mourning at the foot of the cross. The Gospel tells us that 2 thieves were crucified alongside Jesus. One insulted him and demanded that he save them all. The other rebuked his companion's demands, earning him the nickname as the penitent or good thief. Though the Bible does not name these men, the Greek apocryphal Gospel of Nicodemus, which is also known as the Acts of Pilate, names the good thief as Dismas, and the so-called bad or impenitent thief as Gestas. It is the good thief who spoke the words that now form the refrain of the popular Lenten hymn, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Christ falls to the ground under the weight of his cross, close to the sheet's central point. Schongauer turned Christ's head to confront the viewer, emphasizing man's identification with Christ's suffering. The gathering storm clouds foreshadow Christ's death and the pall it cast over the world. As Jesus looks at us, is he saying, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children"? Meditation 9. The Crucifixion of Jesus. Flemish Baroque painter Peter Paul Rubens created two stupendous altarpieces in the early 17th century, one showing the raising of the cross and the other showing Christ's deposition. Though they were originally made separately for two different churches in Antwerp, they are now displayed together on either side of the chancel of Antwerp Cathedral. The panel you see here is 15 feet high and 11 feet wide. It is the central panel of one of the triptychs and shows the soldiers and executioners struggling to raise the cross of Jesus. Though brutally attached by nails at his hands and his feet, Jesus appears heroic and calm, looking up toward heaven, appealing to God to forgive his fellow men. As Luke tells us he said, "For they know not what they are doing." Rubens based the figure of Jesus on a famous ancient statue of the Trojan priest Laocoon, which he had recently seen and sketched during a trip to Rome. The bulging muscles and crouching poses of the executioners show that Rubens also studied Michelangelo's magnificent paintings in the Sistine Chapel. Typical of Baroque drama, the scene invites us to imagine that we are witnessing the event live, watching in agony as Jesus is hoisted up to meet his death. Because we see the crucifixion as it is happening, we are tempted to imagine that we could stop the horror, though we know we are helpless, as those few followers who did not abandon or deny Jesus at the end were also helpless. We also know that though horrible, the death of Jesus is a necessary part of God's plan for mankind's salvation. Our verse is from the book of John, chapter 19, verses 16b to 18a. So they took Jesus, and carrying the cross by himself, he went out to what is called the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha. There they crucified him. Meditation 10. The Crucifixion of Jesus. Then two bandits were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself! If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." This is from Matthew chapter 27, verses 38 to 40. The Flemish painter and printmaker Lucas van Leyden created numerous large-scale prints like this one, which he created in 1517. His prints were widely admired for their silvery tonalities and atmospheric effects that often look more like a drawing than an engraving. This print is about the same size as the Schongauer Road to Calvary we looked at earlier. It measures 11 by 16¼ inches. Lucas carved his printing plates with a light touch and used a dry ink to achieve a matte finish. A contemporary of the great German printmaker Albrecht Dürer, Lucas van Leyden offered a striking contrast to him, both with his line and his compositional organization, which often inverted the expected centrality of the most important figures. Here, the foreground is filled with a boisterous crowd, most of whom pay no attention to the terrifying crucifixion taking place behind them at the left. Some have come to watch, others to jeer, others to gossip and visit with friends. In the left foreground, we see the soldiers who cast lots for Jesus' clothes. Only a small group seems to recognize the tragedy of the event as they gather at the foot of the cross on the remote hillside. By placing the crucifixion in the distance of a wide panorama, Lucas forces us to see ourselves among the crowd. inspiring us to contemplate and meditate upon the cruelty and indifference most directed toward Jesus. Where are we? Do we stand and weep at the foot of the cross like Mary and John? Have we denied knowing Jesus and fled like Peter and the other apostles? Do we want to fit in and mingle among the onlookers, casting aspersions towards Jesus and the thieves, only seeing a punishment fitting for their crimes? Lucas's original audience was a Christian one, but his clever inverted composition reminds us that we are all sinners and that none of us truly has the right to judge others. Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone. Meditation 11. The Crucifixion of Jesus. Spanish artist Diego Velázquez has stripped away the chaos and confusion of the event of the crucifixion to create a simple and serene image of Jesus on the cross. By placing the body of Christ against a neutral black background, Velázquez forces the viewer to focus on Jesus alone. Furthermore, the artist has removed any indication of pain or suffering by placing Jesus' feet on a small platform. Christ's head hangs forward, indicating his death, but his body remains strong and untroubled. A slight halo signifies his divinity. The stark contrast of light and dark, known as tenebrism, as we have learned, was also popular in 17th century Spain. Here, it also serves to remind viewers how, quote, from noon on, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. This passage from Matthew 27, verses 45 and 46 continues, and about 3 o'clock, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, that is, my God, why have you forsaken me? This painting originally adorned the sacristy of the Benedictine convent of the Blessed Incarnation of San Plácido in Madrid, Spain, a fitting subject for the space where communion was prepared. The image is in keeping with Counter-Reformation efforts to defend Catholic dogma against Luther and his Protestant followers, in this case regarding the dogma of communion, which taught that during the event the bread and wine transubstantiated or became the body and blood of Christ. Meditation 12. The Death of Jesus. Our quote is from Luke chapter 23, verse 46. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. Having said this, he breathed his last. Flemish artist Anthony van Dyck brilliantly captures the last moments of Christ's life in this vivid portrayal of the crucifixion. Van Dyck focuses our attention on Christ's body and his suffering, removing all indications of the other men executed alongside him or the crowd that had gathered to watch. Blood streams from his hands, his feet, and his side as the wind whips through his meager garment. Dark, threatening clouds gather and obscure the sun, creating an eerie glow that heightens the tragic drama of the scene. Jesus arches his back and neck, indicating both his physical torment and his resignation to his fate. The Gospels recount 7 sayings uttered by Jesus while he hung on the cross. Despite his suffering, he pled, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Despite this merciful request, he cried out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? As the end drew near, he claimed, it is finished. And finally, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. Viewers can easily call to mind each of these statements as they contemplate Christ's sacrifice, portrayed so movingly by Van Dyck. Like his compatriot Peter Paul Rubens, Van Dyck trained in his hometown of Antwerp, Flanders, which is now in Belgium, and also worked in Italy and in England. He created this painting while studying in Venice, Italy, and it still hangs there in its original location in the Church of San Zaccaria. Meditation 13. The Burial of Jesus. As recounted in John chapter 19, verses 38 to 42, after these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, asked Pilate to let him take away the body of Jesus. Pilate gave him permission, so he came and removed his body. Nicodemus, who had first come to Jesus by night, also came, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, weighing about 100 pounds. They took the body of Jesus and wrapped it with the spices in linen cloths, according to the burial custom of the Jews. Now there was a garden in the place where he was crucified, and in the garden there was a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. And so, because it was the Jewish day of preparation, and the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. Florentine painter Giotto di Bondone painted this heart-wrenching scene of mourners gathered around the dead body of Jesus before he was placed in his tomb. Giotto captures the range of human grief, from the stoic to the overcome. Even the angels in heaven cry out in anguish, pulling their hair, pleading with God, and weeping over the loss of Jesus. This specific occurrence is not mentioned in the Bible, but was imagined by Simeon Metaphrastes, a 10th century Byzantine theologian, who expounded on John's Gospel to imagine a lament of the Blessed Virgin, in which Mary recalls her son's childhood while holding his dead body in her arms. Simeon has her say, quote, "These hands which swaddled thee then, let them bind thy grave clothes now. And yet, O bitter funerals, O giver of life from the dead, liest thou dead before mine eyes? Must I, who said hush beside thy cradle, wail this passion upon thy grave?" Images of the Lamentation, or epitaphios, quickly became popular in both Eastern and Western art. Surely, writers and artists presumed, the friends and family of Jesus mourned his death after taking him down off the cross. Prior to preparing his body for burial, we see Mary hold her son in her lap one final time, while other women hold his head, his hands, and his feet. John, overcome with grief, throws his hands out behind him as he leans towards his teacher. Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea stand behind him and look on in quiet contemplation. All of them honor their teacher before placing him in the fresh tomb. This scene is one of 36 painted by Giotto for the chapel of the wealthy Paduan banker Enrico Scrovegni in the year 1305. Scrovegni was worried about the soul of his father, also a banker, as well as his own. Loaning money at interest, also known as usury, was believed to be a terrible sin. Scrovegni hoped that his beautiful chapel would serve as penance. As banker to the Pope, Scrovegni was able to secure a special indulgence, or relief of days in purgatory, for all visitors who came to his frescoed chapel. As fresco must be painted on moist plaster, the artist had to break his work up into areas he could complete within a day. The joins would be touched up once the wall had dried, but over time these have become exposed as the paint has flaked away, revealing the puzzle-like effect that was not originally seen. Let us conclude by hearing the words of Simeon Metaphrastes again. "These hands which swaddled thee then, let them bind thy grave clothes now. And yet, O bitter funerals, O giver of life from the dead, liest thou dead before mine eyes? Must I, who said hush beside thy cradle, wail this passion upon thy grave?"
He was cut off out of the land of the living for the transgressions of thy people. Was he stricken?
Thank you for following these meditations with me. I hope you will share them with your friends and enjoy them for many Easter seasons to come.